And welcome to the Monday morning message for chapter number 5, appointment scheduling. So let's dive right into this. Appointment scheduling, probably the most critical thing for any doctor's office, of course, is scheduling appointments, and that's getting people into the office because that's how we get paid, when we see patients in the office. So probably the most important piece of the office is the telephone system, which we kind of discussed in the previous chapter. And this chapter talks about what we do when we actually have patients on the phone. So we're going to go ahead and kind of skip to slide number 4. I had mentioned in chapter 4 about answering the call typically within the first 4 rings, right? So answering in a timely manner, being professional and courteous. If you remember, I said, kill them with kindness, that kind of that just really speaks volumes of the practice that you work in, is when you really treat people with respect and dignity. And, regardless of what the patient is bringing to you, if they're upset, if they're angry, if they're, bothered by something, if they're in a tremendous amount of pain, still remaining calm, remaining professional, and, really using just a, good tone, and displaying, empathy for that patient or sympathy for that patient is what I think is the most important thing to do when you're dealing with patients on the phone. Okay, so verify what the phone call is about. Does the patient need to schedule? Are they requesting a refill? Whatever that case is, and then direct their call appropriately, right? Okay, so whenever we're dealing with new patients, we have 2 types of patients: new patients and established patients. So let's talk about the new patients first. Whenever we're dealing with new patients, get their full name, get their full legal name, get their date of birth, and that's very important. The date of birth, oftentimes, I think sometimes some practices take that for granted. And the problem with that is that the majority of our practices will have patients, multiple patients with the same name. So that date of birth is very important. So if you think of something like, John Smith, most practices have a John Smith or more. James Smith, Jones, very common last names. Typically you'll have multiple patients with that name. So get that date of birth. Okay. Also get return phone numbers, get those fairly quickly. What happens if something happens and we drop the call? We can call that patient right back and get them back on the line. And then what is the reason for the visit? And that way we can kind of determine how much time we need to give the patient for that visit. Okay. What type of insurance do they have? Very important. You don't want to run into that situation where you schedule an appointment for a patient and then they come in and they present their insurance to you, and then you realize your practice doesn't contract with that insurance. It's embarrassing. It upsets patients. It makes them very, very angry. Patients sometimes have taken a day off of work or, had to make special arrangements for work and for the kids. And when we waste their time, it doesn't look good upon us. And trust me, bad experiences like that, patients will go talk and they will, tell their friends. And especially this day and age with social media, people are really, in that mode of critiquing others and what they do. And so we don't want to do that. So ask insurance right up front. And if you do not take their insurance, if you don't contract with their insurance, usually we'll have a list of providers, relatively close to us that do take that insurance. So share that information with them, okay? Ask them if they need directions to the doctor's office. That's important. Some patients call and they really don't even realize where we are, okay? Let's see, let them know they probably need to bring a photo ID with them to their first appointment. This is the perfect opportunity to discuss things like payment, whether there's payment of their, co-pays due at the time of service. If they're a cash pay patient, full payment at the time of service. Possibly do we discount them for being a cash pay patient? Have them bring their, tell them to bring their insurance card as well so that we can make copies of that and get their information input into our systems. So that's all important stuff. Okay. Find out if they have any copies of, previous things. If they're coming in for something in particular, like a sore knee or something, ask them if they've seen anybody previously for that. And if they have anything like x-rays or MRIs, to bring copies of those or copies of the reports of those. Okay. So a new patient typically is defined as somebody who we haven't seen in the last 3 years in our office. So what that means is that we could have a former older patient, an established patient that was established previously, and maybe they moved away. Maybe they moved, halfway across the country, and now they're back, 6 years later. We treat them as a new patient, so we kind of have to go through all the new patient stuff, new patient paperwork. Remember, if they've been gone for more than 3 years, they've probably had healthcare issues happen to them within that 3-year period. And if that's the case, then we want to make sure that we get updated. So we're going to need new insurance information. We're going to need to have them do new patient paperwork and let us know of anything that might have transpired within the last 3 years. I used the example of a patient that's been gone for 6 years. Most certainly within the last 6 years, there's been probably some medical related issues with that patient. So we treat them as if they're a new patient if it's been more than 3 years since they've been into the practice, okay? If it's been less than 3 years, then we consider them an established patient. With that new patient, we may even have to create a new chart. A lot of us, if we have paper charts in particular, those take up a lot of room. So when somebody's been gone for 3 years or more, we typically take their charts out of the active charting system and then store those someplace. Oftentimes those are off-site, so it may take time for us to get those old records on that patient. So we may have to create a new chart for that patient, okay? So again, established patient is somebody who's been in within the last 3 years, okay? Time, again, I mentioned it in chapter 4. It all depends on the practice gets to determine how much time they allot for appointments. Again, just as kind of a general rule, most practices for something that's fairly simple in nature, like a sore throat, maybe a 10 or 15-minute visit. Something that's more in-depth, say abdominal pain or an injury of some type, that may be a 30-minute appointment or more. And then physicals typically are about 45 minutes to an hour. And that usually depends on what's being done in that physical. Okay. So here's some good guidelines that are pretty close to realistic. A new patient, 45 minutes. But again, it depends on the practice. So even practices that have a new patient with a sore throat, we're not doing a physical on that patient for the sore throat. We're just doing the sore throat. So 45 minutes may be too much time. So it depends on the practice, okay? I would also say with this, well child checks, usually, as a family practice guy, 15 minutes is typically not enough time. So I'd say that's more like a 30-minute deal. BP checks, cholesterol checks, that kind of monitoring of chronic conditions usually is, anywhere from 5 to 15-minute visit, depending on what we're doing in that situation. Okay. New patients are typically seen longer just because we don't know anything about them. So we're trying to get information about them. Computerized scheduling, of course, the majority of us now do computerized scheduling versus doing it on paper. It's just more efficient. It creates a good, we typically, back up those systems. So we have a good archive that, doesn't take up storage space. We keep it on a server. So there's a lot of advantages to that. Advantages can be, that several staff members can access a patient's chart or the scheduling system all at the same time from, different locations within the office. It also allows, the physicians to potentially access their schedule as well. Okay. Disadvantages, the cost is typically a disadvantage. A scheduling software program typically will run anywhere from, a couple $1,000s to, $10,000. It depends on, all the bells and whistles that you want with the system. And then you also have the training component. Not everybody is great at using computers. Not everybody wants to use computers necessarily. So the training process and getting people comfortable with that can also take time, so that can be a disadvantage. Paper scheduling disadvantages, handwriting. We all know that doctors don't seem to be able to write legibly so that we can read it. It's not quite as efficient. The patients may have to wait to check in for their appointments because we might have to do this one at a time if we're doing it by paper. Advantages are that it's a well understood technique, especially for those of us that are older that have been around for a while. Appointment books and appointment scheduling by hand is pretty well understood by most of us, okay? So different types of scheduling, I like this because we do employ different scheduling mechanisms. So cluster scheduling is booking several patients around the same block of time. A good one for cluster scheduling might be possibly scheduling a lot of the same type appointments right around the same time. So let's say maybe immunizations. Maybe we'll do that where we do immunizations between 10 in the morning and 10:30 in the morning. And we may cluster a whole bunch of, 5, 6, 7 different immunizations within that time period. Double booking, most of us have probably heard that term. You may have been, a victim of double booking as a patient. Double booking is something we typically try to avoid. However, it's oftentimes done for emergency situations. It can also be done for things where, like, the physician, say, has a schedule that gets booked out way in advance. When that gets booked out way in advance, oftentimes we don't have, potentially appointments for existing patients. And in order to try to get them in, we may book them on top of somebody else's appointment. What most of us try to do, though, is we typically try to find times that make sense to do the double booking. So let's say you have a 30-year-old, male who's coming in for a physical, doesn't have any, pre-existing conditions, comes in once a year and always, almost always gets a clean bill of health. Well, that might be the perfect person to double book at the end of their physical. Meaning, let's say we gave the doctor an hour with that patient. What I might do is take off the last 15 minutes of that appointment and put in an extra patient. That works if the situation, dictates that it works, right? If it's the right patient and we're on time, that can work fairly well. Then we can squeeze in that patient, get them taken care of kind of on an emergent basis, yet still do that physical. For young, healthy people, typically their physicals go a little bit quicker than the time we allotted for them. So that would be the example of how we might, use double booking in that case. Again, we try not to double book if we can avoid it. Some practices do it fairly frequently and others don't. Okay. Fixed appointment scheduling typically is just that, a fixed appointment time. We can do that in a couple of different forms. We can do something like wave scheduling or a modified wave. So wave scheduling means that patients are scheduled only for the first half of each hour. So when we start scheduling for a particular day, so let's say we're just scheduling for, today is Friday, so let's say we're scheduling for next Friday. What we might do is we always start out scheduling patients for next Friday at the top of the hour. So we start at 8 o'clock in the morning, first patient. Next person we might put in is at 9. Next person would be 10, and we try to do that, and then we fill in between all those hours of time. A modified wave may be possibly doing something like 2 or 3 patients scheduled at the same time, like 2 patients scheduled at 8 o'clock, and then followed by, other patients at like every 15 minutes. So 8:15 and 8:30. And oftentimes what we'll do is if we schedule 2 people at the same time, then it's it's a first come, first serve. So whichever one of the two shows up first, they're the one that gets taken back first. Okay. Open hour scheduling basically is first come, first serve. The example of that would be something like, you know, the majority of urgent cares, right? We don't schedule appointments for a lot of urgent care things unless they're doing like family practice work as well. So open hour scheduling is just the first come, first serve. Typically, we have to make an assessment. If you remember going back to chapter 4, we talked about triage, where we make an assessment and then determine which patient we might take back. You know, if we have multiple patients there at the same time. But typically open hours is no appointment scheduling required there, right? Okay, so the appointment book is a legal document. So if we think about even an electronic appointment scheduling system, that becomes our legal document of, you know, who came in that day, what time they came in, if anybody missed appointments, that type of thing. Okay. Examples of unforeseen appointments, you know, these are like your walk-ins, right? You know, busy family practices like ones that I've worked in oftentimes will have, you know, those walk-in patients that, you know, oh, I was in the neighborhood and I need to get this done, or I just got hurt in my garage on my table saw and I got cut and I think I need a couple stitches, and they just walk into the doctor's office. These things happen, and in busier practices, they tend to happen a little bit more frequently. So we typically try to handle those as we can. Every practice I've ever worked in, if we've had walk-ins, we try to accommodate them. We try to take care of them that day if we can. Some things we can't, some things are not emergencies, and maybe we just don't have any room, or it's near the end of the day and we just can't squeeze them in. We'll try to urge them to make an appointment for tomorrow or the day after. Okay. Some solutions for that, leave certain times of the day open possibly. I worked in a practice once, you know, 20 years ago, where we had, what did we have? I think we had 6 providers in the practice. 4 of the 6 were always booked well in advance, you know, weeks in advance. So they were hard to get into. And we started to run into a problem where patients were upset about that because they couldn't get in to see, you know, their doctor in quick order. And some patients felt like they you know, they needed that. So what we came up with was an idea where we left every single day open between 11 and 12, so right before lunch. So you couldn't schedule any patients between 11 and 12 until that day. Now, that may sound like maybe you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because what happens if we don't, you know, fill that time slot? Then we just lost an hour's worth of revenue. The good thing is that in really busy practices where you know, you're always having extra patients, you're double booking, your providers are booked out for weeks in advance, almost never do you have a problem filling that hour. As a matter of fact, in that particular practice, usually by 8:30, 8:45 every day, we would have that full hour booked out already. But that freed up some space, gave us a little bit of flexibility, and gave patients, you know, better access to their provider. If we left that hour open on those 4 particular providers that were always booked out well in advance, we did it on them first and found that it really, really worked well. So then we eventually added the other 2 providers as well, and just left everybody's schedule open every day from 11 to 12 and only booked on that day. Okay. So that, you know, there's little things that can be done. There's certainly other ways, you know, other ways of doing things. I kind of like point number 2, generally 15 to 30 minute appointments. Could be at the end of the morning or the end of the afternoon. That would be another way of trying to make up sometimes for some lost time. We've all been to a doctor. You know, most of us, I'm going to say, have been to a doctor where the doctor was running really far behind. 9 times out of 10, guys, I've got to tell you, it's usually not because the doctor doesn't care about your time. It's not because the doctor thinks that your time's not important. What usually happens is that patients come in with oftentimes more than what they said they were coming in with. Also, sometimes their problems may not be necessarily, they may not think it's a big deal, you know, where they think like somebody with lower right abdominal pain may not think that they're having an appendicitis, and they may just think they ate some foul food and now they're having a stomach ache, and but you know they want to come in and see the doctor just to make sure, and it ends up being a much longer issue than what it was, especially for something like that. If it's an appendicitis, we have to go through the provider is going to go through a fairly, you know, detailed examination, and then we've got to get that patient, you know, out the door for a CT scan, and that can take some time. So those two types of situations, you know, patients that come in with more than what they said, and patients whose problems were greater than what they thought, oftentimes those can take up a lot of time and then throw us behind. So this is typically, those two reasons are, for me at least in my history, have been the two primary reasons for why doctors run behind. And then of course, you know, when you have, you know, 2 or 3 patients in the morning that cause that, then of course you're going to be behind in the morning, and then in the afternoon, especially if you know, even if you have one patient that throws you behind 30 minutes, you're really behind for 30 minutes the whole rest of the day. Okay, so we're always trying to find ways to combat that. No 2 days are alike. You know, we affectionately call that flow when we don't have good flow for the day. That can be a challenge. We're always challenged with trying to maintain good flow, have good timing, get patients in and out appropriately and efficiently. And I'll tell you, it's very hard to do. It takes some creativity and some flexibility. So again, if you go back to what I've told you, you know, before about being flexible and being adaptable, right? Those are my 2 key terms to working in a doctor's office in any capacity, being flexible and adaptable, okay? So we already killed the triage last week. Again, this is an assessment of the patient's needs, the patient's problems. Appointment reminder cards. Everybody likes this as an idea. You know, it sounds good and it looks good on paper. The problem is it gets expensive. You know, sending appointment reminder cards, especially for routine things or something that was, you know, set up a couple of days ago, it costs money. Postage is expensive. You know, printing postcards is expensive. You know, these 2 items will run you thousands of dollars a year in getting those things done. Then you've got to have the manpower to do that, right? To, you know, put addresses on, put stamps on. Even if you have an automatic stamp machine, you still have to, somebody has to do it, right? So you have to put the information, you know, why they're being reminded to come in, put their address on it, get it stamped, get it in the mail. This takes time. So I know in my last office that I worked in, the only thing we ever did reminders for, where we sent cards out, were physicals. Oh, I'm sorry, not for physicals. We would call reminder for physical. So we would call people the day before, remind them they have a physical tomorrow, and if they needed to cancel, great. Again, busy practice, we'll fill that time slot. But we would send reminder cards for the other things like follow-ups. You know, maybe a female follow up a pap smear. Maybe there was an abnormal finding and we wanted to repeat it. Follow up things like diabetes checks, cholesterol checks. For the men, you know, a prostate exam. We would send out reminder cards for that. Again, it takes time, and it's one of those, honestly, it's a necessary function to do that. But we try to figure out how to do that as efficiently and as inexpensively as possible, okay? So I already hit the reminder calls, okay? Correcting a paper appointment book, you know, anytime we're correcting anything that we write, you never use whiteout, which is correction fluid. Never use that. You never obliterate or like black something out. You never, you don't erase things. When we make a mistake on a written document, whether that's the appointment schedule or something in a paper chart, It's a single line through it. We draw a single line, one single line through it. We typically initial it, date it, and then write the correction next to it. This is because, you know, the patient's chart information and the appointment scheduling book, those are legal documents. They can be hauled into court. They can be viewed or subpoenaed by attorneys. And what we don't want to do is give the appearance that we're hiding, that we're hiding something. We don't want to give that appearance, right? We want to be able to see the mistake. And then we want to see the correction, okay? So that way, you know, if anybody's looking at it like an attorney, then they can see that, okay, this is what you wrote, and you said it was incorrect, so you wrote this, and now I can see how, you know, 1 and 1 make 2, okay? So very important to remember that. All right. Correcting electronic scheduling is typically a little bit easier. Usually we can just correct that. We can you know, cancel an appointment and make a new appointment, or we can move an appointment from one day to another. Usually just the click of a mouse. We can drag appointments from one day to another or one time to another. So definitely much more efficient. Okay. No-shows, patients who don't show up, patients who made appointments and then never arrived, didn't call, didn't let us know. This is bad. We don't like this. It costs us time and money. When you look at it from our perspective, it's, you know, it's not courteous, it's not professional to do. It costs us time and money, and it potentially costs other patients the ability to come in and see us, because had the patient called and canceled the appointment, we could have gotten patients in. But if we had a full schedule, maybe we turned some patients away and then somebody no-showed, and that tells us, God, we didn't have to turn them away today, but we didn't know, right? So it really is imperative that we kind of hammer home and train patients that calling and letting us know that they cannot make it for their appointment is the right thing to do. It's the, you know, the courteous thing to do, that respects the office and the doctor's time, and it also respects other patients, right? So that other patients can get in. Some offices will assess no-show fees. My last office, we assessed a $50 no-show fee for regular appointments and a $100 no-show fee for physicals. Now here's the deal. What we would normally do is we would send the patient, if they no-showed us and they racked up that fee or incurred that fee, we would send them a bill for that fee. What typically happens is patients will usually call and they'll either be upset, they don't want to pay it, or they'll be bewildered and they want to understand what it's for. And even when you tell them, you know, that, hey, you made an appointment and you didn't show up, and sometimes they play, you know, I don't remember making that appointment. That's fine. What typically happens, I know in my last practice, what we used to do is we would send that bill. And then no matter what the patient called back with and said, what we would do is typically give them the kind of the slap on the wrist. And then we would just write off that, that bill, right? So we would give them an opportunity at one time, the first time, you know, they call, and sometimes they call and they're very apologetic. You know, they apologize, I'm so sorry, I totally spaced it out, it was a busy day, or I had an emergency, whatever. So, you know, we oftentimes try to give people the benefit of the doubt. So what we'll do is we'll excuse it that first time, and then that's the opportunity to remind that patient, because now you know, right? The patient knows that if I do that again, I'm going to get a bill and they're going to make me pay it. You know, they're going to ask me to pay that. So, so usually what we'll do is we'll write off that first one, kind of as a no harm, no foul, reiterate what the policy is, which was typically given to them at their first visit. And oftentimes we made them sign that too, saying they understood there was a no-show policy. And, you know, unfortunately, the majority of us, you know, we sign things, we don't read it completely, or we don't understand it, or we don't ask questions, and we just sign it and we move on. And that's unfortunately what happens a lot of times with patients too. But usually we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that first time, and then anything after that, right, you kind of been warned, so don't do it again, okay? No-shows, typically, if there are more than 2 no-shows in a patient's chart, and we document no-shows in the patient's chart, usually, you know, 2 or 3 no-shows, that chart's going to go back to their doctor, and their doctor's going to make a decision. The doctor's either going to call that patient and say, hey, what's going on? You keep making appointments and you don't keep them. Or the doctor may simply let that patient go from the practice and say, look, I can't keep having you make appointments and then not come in. It's not good for my business. It's not good for my other patients. So sometimes we have to let patients go for that. If it's really blatant, and especially if it's blatant and they've been warned and we've gone over the policies again and it just keeps happening, then we might let patients go at that point. Okay. Let's see, anything else on here we can kind of get into? Probably not. I already kind of talked about the, running behind and that type of thing. Patients will get irritated with that. One of the things I would tell you is that you should always recognize that with patients, meaning that when a patient comes in and I know that we're really far behind, maybe we're 30 minutes behind, usually what I do is instead of letting that patient sit out in the waiting room and keep watching me go by and wondering why they're not coming back, I usually will let them know right away that, I'm really sorry, we're running a little bit behind. I'm going to get you back as soon as I can. Making that acknowledgement oftentimes will bring down a patient's irritability, bring down their anxiety, bring down, their being upset that they've been waiting for so long. So I typically try to acknowledge patients early, usually when they first come in, let them know. And then if I keep going by, keep walking by them and not taking them back, I may update them on the status of what's going on. Like, next time I come back, I'm coming to get you, or, whatever the case is. Acknowledge people so that they know. One of the things that drives me nuts is I go into a doctor's office and I see their, medical assistant keep walking by and they're not making any eye contact with me. But in my mind, I'm like, well, I know I'm here, but what's going on? So acknowledging that right up front usually is a better tactic. Okay. And let's see, anything else on here? Probably not much. Sometimes we have to block out times for things like, the doctor's going to a conference, or doctor's having some kind of a meeting, maybe a meeting with another doctor, maybe meeting with a pharmaceutical rep. So sometimes we block out time in the schedule. We typically refer to that as the matrix. That's time we block out where the doctor's not seeing patients. Okay. Hospital scheduling, I don't think I need to add a whole heck of a lot on that part. So I think I am going to go ahead and leave it there for chapter number 5, scheduling. So read over the chapter, please. I know there's a few things in there that I may not have gone over, so it's imperative that you read your chapter as well. And I look forward to seeing you next week for Monday Morning Message covering chapter 6.